we figured out the solution to cancer. I'm like, what is it? It's this big discovery. He's like, and the cause. I'm like, what is it? He's like, it's sugar.
So all of these diseases are actually diseases of too much insulin. So if you look at obesity, for example, if you were to measure the levels of insulin, people who are more overweight tend to have higher insulin. Same with type 2 diabetes. Hyperinsulinemia and insulin resistance are really sort of two sides of the same coin. So one causes the other. Sort of hyperinsulinemia can cause insulin resistance can cause hyperinsulinemia. So they're really the same thing. And again, the same thing applies to sort of cancer. And this is the pattern that was noticed so many years ago, that there are these diseases of sort of too much insulin, which is that sort of, they all go together, the heart disease. And you don't see that in people eating traditional diets because they're not eating all the time. So I remember there was a study, this NHANES study, which is a big sort of American survey of lots of things, but they included dietary habits. So in 1977, they found that most people ate 3 times a day, so breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And by 2004, it was almost up to 6 times a day, right? So it's like, wow, that's crazy. And it was never this sort of deliberate, hey, there's good scientific evidence that we should eat 6 times a day. It just sort of crept in there. And I think part of it was, of course, the snack food companies wanted to promote it. And, people thought it was a good idea. So then it became almost gospel. Oh, you have to eat 6 times a day, right? And I remember thinking about it a while ago and thinking, where did that suddenly sneak in? Because did we have a big randomized controlled trial that I missed somehow? Because I don't think so. It was just this gradual change in attitudes. And you saw it because I start to think back to my upbringing in the 70s, right? So I grew up in the 70s. And if you wanted a sort of after school snack, your mom said, no, you're going to ruin your dinner, right? And if you wanted a bedtime snack, your mom would say, no, you should have ate more at dinner. And it's like, that's just the way it was. And of course, people would have this sort of natural fasting period from after dinner, which was say 6 o'clock, because people ate a bit earlier back then, to like say 8 o'clock. So 14 hours of fasting every single day without even...
We call that breakfast.
Yeah, exactly.
Breaking the fast.
Breaking the fast. That is the word that we use. And it's like somehow we went from that, where people didn't have the obesity problems, type 2 diabetes problems, because they have this natural fasting period built in that has always been there. It's even built into the English language. And then it's like, oh, you got to eat all the time. And it's like, oh, you can't ever skip your breakfast. You got to snack all the time, right? You see it in schools, for example. Oh, they go to school, they get a mid-morning snack, then they have a lunch, and then they have their after-school snack, and then they have the dinner. Then, you're playing soccer, and they think that they need to have a snack in between the halves of soccer. I'm like, I played.
Well, Jason, you've written a lot about fasting and the effects of either time-restricted eating, which is 12, 14, 16-hour fast every day, or taking a 24-hour, 36-hour fast a week, or even longer fast for diabetes. And I'd love you to sort of share why around cancer this is so important. And on my podcast soon, we're going to have Dr. Patrick Hanaway, who is my colleague and friend, was the medical director at Cleveland Clinic, who had cancer and used fasting as an approach to his cancer treatment. He still got radiation, but he also did it in a way that actually reduced all the side effects to almost none, has kept him healthy now for well over a year. And this cancer was not a great one, and let him go through the process with really no issues, which was really staggering, and really went on a ketogenic diet in order to do that, which is both using fasting and ketogenic diets to drop insulin levels to almost undetectable. So can you talk about this whole idea of fasting, cancer, ketogenic diets, why it's so important, and how it connects to this whole idea of insulin resistance and high insulin levels?
Yeah, so both fasting and ketogenic diets have the same sort of goal at the end, which is trying to lower insulin. Because the difference between a ketogenic diet, say, and a low carb diet is that, you're sort of low carb, ultra low carb for the keto, but sort of moderate protein, because protein can also stimulate insulin. Whereas some of the older low carb diets were like very high in protein. You take protein shakes or whatever it is. And that's like generally Atkins, not, right? Yeah, like Atkins. And so high protein is not always the best idea because you can get high insulin, but you also get this high mTOR, which is sometimes not so good for cancer as well. But the idea is to really drop your insulin levels. And if these are diseases of too much insulin, then that's going to be a very useful adjunctive treatment. So fasting is actually fascinating because there's all these different things we're discovering. So one of the things is sort of autophagy. So as you fast, of course, your nutrient sensors go down, so mTOR, insulin go down, and then you activate this process called autophagy, where you actually start to break down some of your subcellular organelles and stuff. So basically, your body's just trying to clean house.
It's like Pac-Man coming around and cleaning up all the garbage.
Yeah, exactly. And people think it's a bad thing.
Maybe people know who Pac-Man was, but that was the original video game that we all played back in the 70s. Pretty simple. Very exciting, though.
Yeah,
and people don't know what Pac-Man is anymore.
You can still find them sometimes. But the idea is that people think that this sort of breakdown process is really bad for you, but it's actually really good for you. And in fact, it's sort of one of the keys to rejuvenating the body. That is, you want to break down all your old stuff and then sort of rebuild the old stuff that you need. So the whole idea of fasting is you're trying to put the body into this sort of regenerative maintenance mode. Because what we've recognized over the last little bit is that your body sort of has you can go into growth mode or you can go into sort of this cell maintenance repair mode. And it really depends on your nutrients availability. When nutrients are available, you want to grow. When nutrients are not available, you don't want to grow and you want to go into this sort of maintenance repair mode. And everybody thinks growth is good, but growth is not always good, especially as an adult. So I always say, think about a car. Like if you have a sports car and you rev that engine and you're running it fast all the time, you're going to go fast, which is great, but it's going to burn out much faster. So you can't just keep revving that engine, keep redlining it. You got to sometimes bring it to the shop, put it in the garage, let it rest, and all this stuff.
A pit stop.
Yeah, exactly. A little pit stop. So that's the point of the human body too. You can either go for growth or you can go for longevity or cellular maintenance repair. But you gotta have a bit of both. It's a balance there. It's not all growth. And this is where you say, oh, eat. Well, you're gonna put your body, your nutrient sensor are going to go up, your growth factors are going to go up. You're going to put yourself in growth mode. But you don't want to do that, especially for a disease such as cancer, which is a disease where cells are growing too much. You're basically feeding into that growth, and that's going to be very, very bad for you. So what you do instead is you do the fasting and you put your cells into this sort of maintenance repair mode. And it actually allows you to undergo the both the chemotherapy and probably the radiation therapy better. Because chemotherapy, we have a couple studies on fasting and chemotherapy, where what you do is you fast sort of just before and during and just after your chemotherapy. And what they've noticed is that those people tend to get a lot less side effects from their treatment, because what you've done, of course, is taken the cells of your normal body and you've sort of put them into a more quiescent state. They're not trying to grow. They're actually trying to slow down. And chemotherapy, the general way it works is it kills the fastest growing cells, which are usually the cancer cells. But it also kills like the hair follicles because they're fast growing cells. It kills the lining of the GI tract, so you get nausea and your hair falls out. So if you can put those cells into sort of a quiescent sort of repair mode, it's not going to sustain as much damage from the chemotherapy. And instead, the cancer cells, which can't stop their growth, they're always trying to grow, they can't do that. So therefore, they're going to sustain full damage from the chemotherapy while your body is relatively protected. And that's one of the things that might be very interesting to use as an adjunct to sort of standard treatment. I would never advise not to take the standard treatment because, of course, you spend...
Well, there's a lot of interesting work by Dr. Mukherjee, Siddhartha Mukherjee and others, looking at ketogenic diets and cancer. And I've heard him present on this. It's just fascinating. He wrote The Emperor of All Maladies. It's about cancer. Right. I'm sure you've read that. And he said that to me, he said, Mark, we figured out the solution to cancer. I'm like, what is it? It's this big discovery. He's like, and the cause. I'm like, what is it? He's like, it's sugar. I'm like, yeah, I guess that's not really news, but maybe it's good you know that now. And then he said, we've been studying ketogenic diets. and seeing incredible results with pancreatic cancer, melanoma, stage 4 cancers that weren't responding to anything else. And in animal models, they literally were curing cancers with ketogenic diets. And now they're doing human trials. Can you talk a little bit about some of that research and how it might be applied to people who are struggling with cancer?
Yeah, so this was the sort of big discovery of Dr. Lou Cantley, who's discovered sort of this whole pathway, the PI3 pathway that links sort of insulin and growth and cancer. So the important thing is that insulin, it acts as that growth factor and therefore acts as a sort of pro-growth and therefore a sort of pro-cancer agent. Sugar, of course, plays a big role in the hyperinsulinemia. And it's interesting because Dr. Lou Cantley, in several of his articles or whatever, he goes, sugar scares me, right? Here's this guy who studies cancer for a living, and he's like, yeah, sugar just scares me. And that's the same sort of thing that Siddhartha Mukherjee is talking about too, right? And that's the whole point, is that with ketogenic diets, with fasting, and of course, fasting, you have to cycle it because you can't obviously fast. You can't fast forever, right? As opposed to a ketogenic diet, which is sort of very low carbohydrate. You could sustain that for years and years. You can't fast forever. You need some food at some point. But the idea is the same. What you're trying to do is really reduce those insulin levels. They're, of course, studying this in terms of drugs. They're trying to develop these blockers to the whole pathway of PI3K and so on. I think they've developed a couple companies for that. But, just like anything else, it's like, why would you want to do it with a drug when you can do it with your diet?
Well, you know what's so striking, Jason, is that, often when people go get cancer treatment, their doctors make sure you keep your weight up, eat ice cream, eat milkshakes, have cake, and I'm like, what are you telling them that for? I mean, that is death. And yet it's, I mean, I actually had a radiation oncologist as a patient who worked at MD Anderson, and he was very aware of these studies and these issues. And he tried to tell his patients to do the right thing. He said, all the nutritionists, and this is like the #1 cancer hospital in the world, are telling their patients to eat a lot of starch and carbohydrates and sugar to keep their weight up. And it's just such a unfortunate situation that is going on right now. So when we talk about cancer, we're clearly talking about some of the risk factors, right? Sugar. There's other risk factors, and one of the things that I think is very concerning to me is these obesogens, which are environmental chemicals that not only are directly toxic and carcinogenic, but they're actually causing insulin resistance. So they're really creating a double whammy: pesticides, herbicides, additives, all these environmental chemicals that we're exposed to, 80,000 of them that have been developed over the last 100 years. What's your perspective on that, and how do we reduce our risks?
Well, I think that stuff is really hard because they're not adequately studied. I mean, there's so many chemicals, and what do we know about the effect on the human body for most of these? Like very, very little, right? I mean, they have this classification as generally recognized as safe, but I mean, that just means it doesn't kill you within a month, right? I mean, that's about it. So, and all of these chemicals, and even the ones that we eventually find out are really bad for us. I mean, they were originally approved and for use. So, we trust our government to sort of keep us safe from all these sort of chemicals. Very rudimentary, like you do it you test the toxicology in some rats and it doesn't kill them. And hey, nothing, you get out there and it doesn't kill people right away. So, hey, you're good. That's the sort of idea that we have. But I think that unfortunately, it's hard to know exactly what to say because one, there's just so many of them. They're changing all the time. Chemicals that they're using are just changing. So like the classic sort of pesticide was like DDT. Remember it was, I date myself here a little bit, but DDT was this big time pesticide. It was amazing, killed everything, right? Turned out it was like super, super bad for us and, causing cancer all over the place, right? There's all kinds of stories like that. Now, of course, there's all these other chemicals in there and we don't even know what they are. I mean, they're not listed.
I mean, the government did write a whole report on the environmental chemicals and how they're linked to cancer. So I think that's a big thing. And I encourage people to check out ewg.org, which is the Environmental Working Group's website, where they have guides on how to reduce your exposure through your food, through household cleaning products, through skincare products, and many other ways to reduce your exposures. Household cleaning products. So I think the more we can do to reduce our intake of these chemicals is a good idea. So let's talk about how to reduce your risk. What can people do who are listening that you talk about in your amazing book, The Cancer Code, a revolutionary understanding of the medical mystery? I encourage everybody to get a copy, The Cancer Code. It's out now because it really is a revolution in understanding of cancer that I think would help so many people. So tell us, what can we do to reduce our risk of getting cancer?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is to go after the sort of hyperinsulinemia, because we know it's such a big risk factor. So you can't always test it, but you'll know, because if you are overweight, for example, then you want to try and get back to a normal weight. And there's lots of different ways to do that. Sort of ketogenic diets are not the only way. You can do, all kinds of different diets and vegetarian diets and sort of paleo diets. There's all sorts of good ones. And then the other one, of course, is the sort of reintroduction of intermittent fasting into sort of the normal schedule. And I think that's really important, because what we've lost, of course, is that balance between feeding and fasting, right? We've gone to a sort of feeding all the time model, which is not so good for growth, because you're always telling your body to grow more. And of course, if you have type 2 diabetes, which is becoming a huge, huge problem. So if you look at pre-diabetes and type 2 diabetes in America, it's like it just skyrocketed over the last 15 years. And that too is a sort of massive, massive risk factor for the development of cancer. The World Health Organization actually classifies 13 different types of cancer as obesity-related cancer. So including breast and colorectal. So that's a huge
prostate and
prostate,
colon,
liver, pancreas. And interestingly, if you look at the types of cancer, so we've actually been doing really well for most cancers over time as you track them through the years. Most cancers are actually slowly declining, except those obesity-related cancers. They're actually going up. So pancreatic cancer going up, liver cancer going up. All of these cancers are going up. And they're not rare diseases. So breast cancer, for example, is very, very common. Colorectal cancer, very, very common. And I think that this is one of the things that we hadn't recognized. So I went to medical school in the 90s. We never talked about diet and cancer. It just wasn't even on the radar screen. It was crazy, except maybe a few people who are really into it. But for the most part, we just didn't talk about it. And then it wasn't until sort of 2003 that the first large papers started to come out that said, hey, this is a big risk factor. And then you multiply it by the millions of people who have it. And that's why it's such a big risk factor. So staying to a normal weight, which includes getting your diet in order, cutting out sugar, cutting out the processed foods for the most part, adding back the intermittent fasting, which is part of a normal sort of regimen.
When you say that, what do you mean? You mean time restricted eating, right? You mean
so I think that
14-hour fast.
Yeah, 12 to 14 hours should be your sort of baseline, because that's just 1970s style eating when we didn't have so much obesity. Now, if you're trying to lose weight, or if you have type 2 diabetes, then you can extend it to say 16 hours, which is time restricted eating, or you can even go further, 24 hours, or even multiple days of fasting. And, people always worry about that, but that's why I talk about it a lot, because a lot of the stuff that we worry about simply isn't true. People worry about, they're going to lose muscle, they can't work, they can't concentrate. I'm like, all you're doing when you don't eat is that you're making your body rely on your body's own store of calories, which is sugar, right? Or body fat. That's how your body stores calories. So you're literally using the body fat for precisely the reason that you carry it. So what could be wrong with that? What is more natural than that? If your sugar is high and you don't eat, you're going to use up the sugar and your sugar will fall. Now, that's great news if you have a high sugar and type 2 diabetes, which of course that high sugar drives a high insulin, which drives, cancer risk and so on. So something like that is a completely natural way to get all of this back in order. And if you're too far along the scale of, you have too much insulin, you don't have to stop at 14 hours. There's nothing to stop you from taking your fast out to, couple of
Yeah.
days at a time, right? And that's the thing. It's a free intervention. It's a natural intervention. It's been used for thousands of years, right? Every culture in history has used it. It's crazy that we don't use this sort of
Yeah.
thing.
Well, what you're talking about is just something so extraordinary and effective. And the side effect is that it also prevents heart disease and
Yeah,
diabetes and dementia and depression. And
exactly.
I'm like, pretty much everything. So it's like a
Yeah.
one-stop shop for staying healthy, which is cut out the starch and sugar and practice eating in a way that we're designed, which is take a break after dinner and don't eat till breakfast or a little bit later in the morning. It's so simple, it's so obvious, and it's so different than our current thinking. But if you have cancer, like if you already have cancer, and we can do this to reduce our risk. What about the screenings, the cancer interventions, the treatments that we have now? Should we still do those? How far can this go to really have an impact?
Screening is a very interesting problem because it sort of gets down to the sort of seed and soil idea. So all our cells in our body actually have the potential to become cancer, right? So your heart can get cancer, your liver can get cancer,
Mm-hmm.
even your
Mm-hmm.
placenta can get cancer. It's crazy that every single cell in the body can become cancerous. So the point is that seed sort of lies everywhere, and that aggressive screening we found, may or may not be that useful. So this is the reason why people are sort of backing off a little bit on sort of aggressive screening. Works very well in some cases, like cervical cancer, for example, but taken too far, it was useless. So the thyroid cancer is an example where they screened people in South Korea for thyroid cancer, found a ton of thyroid cancer. It was like everywhere. So the incidence of new thyroid cancer went up sort of 11-fold because of screening, but the mortality was still just about the same. It didn't impact it because most of those didn't need to be treated. So that's the point, is that there's a limit to the screening, but there's well-established protocols that, people have studied. So breast cancer, for example, mammograms have been studied, but they're rolling they used to say, oh, maybe you should start at age 40. And they've actually recently been sort of moving it back down to maybe age 50. Same with colonoscopy, for example. One of the big successes of screening has been colonoscopy, and removal of sort of early cancers has made a big difference in terms of
Mm-hmm.
reducing colon cancer. But they're also talking about, maybe you don't need it. They actually just rolled, I think just last 2 weeks ago or something, they actually said we should start earlier, in part because I think that they're worried that with the obesity epidemic, they're actually getting more and more. So if you look at these obesity-related cancers, we're actually finding them younger and younger because the younger and younger populations are getting more of this obesity. So I think they just recommended, instead of age 50, they actually rolled it down to like age 45 or something to get colonoscopy. So I think it's still a good idea to do screening because it's one of these cautious things, but you have to be wary. So certain things didn't pan out the way we thought. PSA is super controversial for prostate cancer. Thyroid cancer didn't turn out to be useful. So, but you pick and choose. The big ones are going to be breast and colorectal, of course.
So given what you learned about in this research that you did for the Cancer Code, which was an amazing book, and everybody needs to get it, a revolutionary understanding of a medical mystery. What does the future look like for cancer? Because it feels to me as a doctor, someone says I have diabetes, I have Alzheimer's, I have heart disease, I have an autoimmune disease, I have this. I'm like, great, I got that. Cancer, it's like, not so easy. So what does the future look like in terms of prevention and treatment of cancer?
I think there's two different things. So in terms of treatment of cancer, of course, a lot of these things that we talk about are not applicable once you have the cancer. Like you can't just use diet. Like I would never say to somebody, just use the diet or just use fasting. And it's like, no, you need to get that surgery or the radiation or the chemotherapy or whatever they're recommending for you, because by that time, you have a high risk of other issues. You can use it as an adjunct, but the treatments have come a long way because, again, we've moved past now that sort of idea that we need to find the genetic cure for all these cancers. And now we're sort of moving into the age of immunotherapy, which is taking this idea that cancer is sort of this evolving sort of new species and saying, well, let's use our immune system to try and destroy it. So we've been seeing some sort of incredible successes from a therapeutic standpoint with these new agents, these sort of checkpoint inhibitors and CAR T and some of these other things. So really very hopeful. Of course, that depends on a lot of research dollars or very high tech sort of stuff.
Yeah.
But it's more exciting from a prevention standpoint because the only real successes we have in cancer medicine are really in prevention. So stopping smoking, for example, is sort of so far ahead of anything else we do for cancer. And so, but it's all through prevention. Same with colonoscopies and for colorectal cancer. Really, you start to see as these things, as you do more and more screening. So as you go from the 70s to the 80s to the 90s to the 2000s, for example, you can see that as people start, to accept that they need to do this screening, that colorectal cancer mortality is slowly coming down. And that's where the sort of future lies. I'm hopeful because we're starting to bring into sort of clearer picture that, hey, all of these things, these dietary things that we talk about are so important, like stuff that you write about, for example, so well, that, hey, this is great news that people are paying attention to it because those are the cancers that are rising in terms of numbers, right? Those are practically the only cancers that are rising in numbers are the obesity-related cancers. So if we can understand that, if we can make people aware of that, of the dangers of sugar. So for example, sugar intake, I think, peaked at around year 2000. But prior to that was really going up very high, right? People were drinking their Gatorades and stuff. They were like, oh yeah, I just worked out, so I'm going to have a Gatorade. It was just full of sugar, right? People don't do that anymore. Like, I look around, like, how
you'd be surprised. You live in Canada. People maybe are better over there. I think here in America, it's still sugar palooza.
Yeah, probably. I think that plays a big role.
Look, 88% of us are metabolically unhealthy, and the translation of metabolically unhealthy means you are insulin resistant. So think about that. Almost 9 out of 10 Americans are on track for these diseases caused by too much insulin, including cancer. Yeah,
including cancer and all those other diseases you talked about, Alzheimer's and all that sort of stuff. But, and part of it, I think, is, if you look at the total number, like total amount of sugar, it has been going down, but it's still very high. I think that's the big problem. There's a lot of sort of corporate interests and so on. Like, a few years ago, Coca-Cola was revealed as giving like $1 million. Remember this story? They gave $1 million to the University of Colorado to develop the global energy balance network or something like that.
Yeah. I wrote about that in my book, Food Fix. Yeah, it was a big scientific it was like a mess.
It's a horrible story because here you have a university taking millions of dollars from Coca-Cola, which, obviously is peddling something very unhealthy, and was ready to sort of go to war against people like you and me who keep saying, look at food as medicine and what you put in your mouth is super important. Like the university.
It's not just calories are all the same, right?
Exactly. Like this whole calories is the same. Like that always gets me all riled up because it's like, you're telling me that 100 calories of cookies is the same as 100 calories of broccoli. That's the dumbest thing, like, honestly.
Well, it's just because of the law of thermodynamics, right? So the idea is that it's calorie to calorie because when you burn it, it releases the same amount of energy. And that's true. It's absolutely true in a vacuum.
Yeah.
But not when you eat it, because when you eat it, it interacts with your microbiome and your hormones and your brain chemistry and so many different factors that drive benefit or cause harm.
Honestly, it's crazy that we believe it, because if you take 100 calories of cookies and eat it and versus the salmon, for example, or egg or whatever, the hormonal response is completely and utterly different between those two foods. Same calories, different foods, completely different hormonal response. Like insulin shoots way up with the cookies, right? And it's like, you have to pretend that that's completely irrelevant. Like this is physiology, right? Calories.
Jason, I just reviewed the Endocrine Society position paper on obesity and prevention and treatment. that was published in 2018. And they were very clear that a calorie is a calorie is a calorie, and weight loss is about energy balance. And I'm like, what is going on here? Are they not paying attention to the science? Because these are top scientists at the major medical universities.
Yeah.
And these paradigms get so entrenched and so stuck, and we just get so off track. It's really unfortunate. It takes a long time for paradigms to shift. It took 50 years from the time that the Semmelweis discovered that we should wash our hands before surgery to prevent childbirth fever or death in women who are giving birth because of infection, 50 years before they actually started washing their hands before surgery. And the guy died in disgrace with his theories completely ridiculed because doctors couldn't believe that they would be causing an illness. They would never want to harm their patients. So how could it be that they were causing it by not washing their hands? So there was just, we're in a tough situation. It takes literally decades for paradigms to shift.
Not just that, but remember the whole 1980s, the low fat era, right? So I sort of did all my training through that era, and there's those step 1 and step 2 diets, if you remember from.
Yes, of course.
Right? And it's like, so if you had a heart attack, you go on this low fat diet. If you had another one, you had an ultra low fat diet, right? And then it's like,
and that made things worse.
And that made things worse, absolutely. And we talked about the French paradox about how these French are eating full fat milk. And it's like, oh my God, how come
butter and cheese and cream and right.
How are they not having heart attacks? And they're actually having like a third of the heart attacks of Americans. And then, of course, it was crazy because that whole paradigm took like 20 years before people started to say, oh, hey, look, here's some studies on nuts, which are high in fat, and they're really good for you. And fatty fish, they're really good for you. And avocados, they're really good for you. And olive oil. And it's like, it took 20 years of us demonizing all kinds of fat before we finally said, oh, it's a healthy fat, right? And it's like, okay, that took a lot longer than you'd think it should have taken. It's the same idea. Like, it's the same thing with sugar, right? Sugar was fine because it was low fat, right? And that was the thing that you could find in the 80s and 90s.
Snack bar cookies.
But it wasn't just that. The American Heart Association was out, had like saying, oh, cut the fat, but eat the sugar. And I was like, oh,
it's still in our recommendations. Even our dietary guidelines are so contradictory. On one hand, they say we shouldn't worry about fat anymore. On the other hand, they have all these promotional education materials like the go slow foods, like which are saying low fat, and still recommend low fat milk in school lunches.
I remember all those, those sugary cereals, and they all had that health check on it. It's like,
oh my God. American Heart Association. Yes. It's Fruit Loops and Tricks Are for Kids and Cocoa Puffs are all heart healthy because they have no fat.
Yeah. And it's like, they have like 50 grams of sugar in one serving, right? It was ridiculous. So these paradigms take a long time. And I think that calories thing, I'm sort of, disturbed a bit to hear that they're still thinking that.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. Well, your contribution on understanding of cancer has been so great with this book, The Cancer Code. I encourage everybody to get a copy of it. It's really fantastic. Jason, you've really inspired me to even eat less sugar than I already do, and feed my cells right and create a healthy soil, because that's the key here. We know how to create a healthy soil, and it's the obvious thing. It's not just not eating sugar, but it's also eating phytochemical rich food, lots of fruits and vegetables, lots of good fats, nuts and seeds, whole foods, getting rid of all the ultra processed stuff, exercise, sleep, relaxation, stress reduction. All these things are the things you need to create a healthy soil, and also getting your nutrient levels up, right? Because a lot of us are nutrient deficient in vitamin D, which has been linked to cancer incidence if you're deficient. So your book covers all this stuff. It's just fantastic. And I encourage everybody to get a copy. Jason, thank you so much for being on the Doctor's Pharmacy. It's been really a pleasure to have you. Hey, it's Dr. Hyman. If you enjoyed this video, you're going to want to check out this next video coming up.
We have to take proactive steps to protect our DNA. And some of the things that we can do are pretty simple. Like, for example, we know that an elemental vitamin C, can actually do it.